Welcome back to the Catalyst. David, what do you got for us today?
So dominating this week's headlines and the story I want to talk to you guys about was the Chinese spy balloon, which was shot down just off the coast of North Carolina. It traversed a large swath of the U.S. and allegedly was carrying devices to intercept sensitive communications in what was clearly a not so covert espionage mission from the Chinese government. Now, of course, the event was covered exhaustingly in typical polarized fashion. Democrats were defending Biden at every turn, saying there was, nothing wrong with his response to an egregious encroachment into the U.S. airspace. And you even had Republicans complaining that the balloon wasn't shot down quick enough, even though three of these balloons from China actually traversed our airspace under the Trump administration. And these same Republicans have nothing to say. But what's interesting about shooting down the balloon is that, the spyware was the size of a regional jetliner. I think I read a report where it was like the size of three school buses. So if you shoot it down, it could have killed many people, right? If it was in a populated area. So there was some sensitivity there in terms of when and where it should have been shot down. But question for you guys, if you look up in the sky and you see a huge balloon, would you think this was a legitimate espionage mission?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to say, look, it's almost absurd to me that anyone would consider this to be a legitimate espionage mission with high tech surveillance. I mean, this is not 1890, right? I mean, I think we've got other ways of going over continents, and as far as I understand, China has the second highest number of satellites going around the Earth, second only to the United States, almost 500 satellites. And, we can only imagine what kind of technology is up there and what exactly, are they trying to acquire from us. I would say that, the most secretive and high value targets of surveillance are probably buried, underground someplace in Nevada and not, over North Carolina or, wherever this balloon blew over.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, the U.S. military is probably going to hide most of what is most sensitive from, some overflying drone or something like that. But I mean, I think the truth here is that if I remember correctly, the flight path was actually over the North Pole. So I'm assuming they were just trying to get great shots of like polar bears or something. But, the reality of the situation is what you said. I mean, do we really think that China doesn't have the imagery that they would be looking for of the bare, Canadian tundra and United States? Like, of course, that's probably the case. And I think the funny part is yeah, in 2023, there's no way that China filling up a balloon with all this surveillance equipment and passing it through with all of the sophisticated, air trafficking and air tracking systems that exist in virtually every country. There's no way they thought that this would have gone undetected. So to me, my reaction when I was seeing this story happen was, why does this seem like it's almost like a joke? Like you have people reacting, people upset, people getting, it's like either China was doing this to inflame egos and just to get people riled up and upset, or everybody knew that this was for something else. I mean, what was it? I don't know. One thing I do find interesting is that Project Veritas Pfizer story was a pretty big story right as this was starting to happen. And of course, it has pretty well been brushed under the rug. I'm not saying that that's exactly why this happened, but it's convenient that that story is not really being talked about or having to be addressed at all, given that we have this sort of farce-like balloon, making its way from China.
Yeah, the media environment around this was kind of circus-like, right? I mean, it was covered ad nauseum, and you had everyone giving their take on it. And listen, China actually came out and said, there was nothing nefarious about this. I think they were saying it entered the airspace inadvertently. And listen, part of me kind of thinks that they have a point there because it wasn't covert at all. I mean, there's nothing undercover or, it was right there for everyone to see. But what's interesting,
And it has been windy. It has been windy too. So
right? But what's interesting is China has deployed these balloons in a number of other countries. So there's one in South America right now that is there. So maybe there is some legitimate information gathering they're getting. I know the U.S. came out yesterday and said that the purpose of this balloon was to intercept sensitive communications, whatever that means. But maybe they are doing some legitimate atmospheric surveillance. China is trying to control their weather, amongst other things they're trying to control. So they could be doing some legitimate research. Who knows? But the idea that this was a provocative action that people are trying to equate to some kind of deep espionage when it was anybody who just looked into the sky could see this is kind of laughable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of places where this conversation can go, but I like what you said, Joe, is that the fact that, and you too, Dave, the fact that it's being covered so heavily in the media means they're trying to distract us from something else, right? And Joe,
Yeah.
you brought up the Project Veritas video. There's also a very, very big story that came out about the Nord Stream pipelines that were blown up. Seymour Hersh was a phenomenal, long-standing investigative reporter who covered a number of stories way back when that just were explosive in the 60s and 70s about the My Lai massacre and the U.S. biological program. He came out with a very, very provocative article. He has a source basically saying that the United States and Norway were responsible for the destruction of the natural gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. That's an enormous story and not getting the kind of play it deserves. So, we're being told to watch the balloon, literally.
It does feel like the media is ballooning the situation.
For sure. I mean, if we want to talk about the balloon espionage surveillance, let's talk about the ballooning surveillance state of China and how it's influencing the broader world to usher in a new era of dystopian digital authoritarianism. Now, many of our viewers will know that China is the most surveilled country in the world, but let's investigate to what extent that's true. 8 of the most surveilled cities in the world are in China. There's now an estimated 540 million CCTV cameras tracking Chinese citizens as they shop, as they eat dinner, as they leave their home, as they go to work, even when they go to the bathroom at work, they're being watched. And if you're lucky enough, the Chinese government will even install these cameras within your property in your home. As for kids, cameras in China are now recording students' facial expressions, and they log whether they look happy, upset, angry, fearful, or disgusted. And if a student manages to slip away from the camera gaze and hide their facial expressions, an alarm will trigger, and school uniforms are now coming equipped with microchips in the shoulders. In China's ongoing nightmarish concentration camps, where Uyghurs are subjected to unspeakable persecution, all Uyghur children over 12 years old are forced to surrender their biometric data, including voice, blood, DNA samples, and iris scans. And the Chinese government is using this information to determine whether or not a Uyghur child or a Uyghur citizen poses a threat, is a model citizen, or if they're safe for society. Now, when we look at what's happening in China, some may think it's relegated only within the borders of China. However, China is exporting this as a global Chinese surveillance technology industry to over 80 countries. For example, in Uganda, Chinese spy tech is used to spy on opposition political parties. Ecuador has imported Chinese surveillance systems wholesale to spy on its own citizens. And Chinese influence is found in other countries as well. We see, for example, where spyware from Israel was used to hack and spy on the family of slain Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So even in the US, law enforcement is using spy tech tools such as real-time facial recognition and Stingray cell site simulators that siphon data from mobile phones and intercept communications. The Department of Homeland Security is installing face scanning cameras in 20 of our top airports here in the United States. Even your Uber driver and unemployment claimants are being subjected to this facial recognition technology. Household companies in the US like Intel Corp and Cisco Systems have actually helped to build the infrastructure of surveillance in China. And there's nothing stopping them from doing it in the United States and other countries in the West to subject our citizens to the same surveillance technology. So a question for you guys, given all that, do you feel that there's any stopping this growing state of surveillance that now exists in China in what is really just a classic case of Orwellian abuse of technology and surveillance of its own citizenry? What is stopping that from happening here in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere?
I mean,
Joe? Yeah.
in my opinion, honestly, I think what will stop it is people standing up to it and not putting up with it. I mean, that's an entirely different question in terms of how you get that to happen and how that's done. I know there was, instances in Europe, for example, where I believe there were a certain type of traffic camera, like almost like a speed camera, that people were just vandalizing and constantly breaking and shutting down because nobody supported it. I'm curious as to where that program is today, because I know that that type of pushback, was kind of leading towards questioning whether or not this was a good technology. But, I think it comes to people having awareness, people not falling for the rhetoric that this is good for you and that this is for your own good, and having sort of a backbone to stand up. Last thing I'll say on this is, in Canada here, I don't think people culturally have the same level of sort of free spirit. Like, we're freedom is everything, as in the US, right? That's a big part of the cultural US. And I think if it's, if there's going to be pushback, it probably is going to come from the US, and other countries may follow based on that. But, that's my observation.
I agree. It's going to come from this country. Absolutely. That, this is the country that should stand up for it. I feel like our job here and our role is to talk about it openly. And I think we can be pretty clear that China is a testing ground for the United States by these techno elites, and these other countries that you mentioned, like Ecuador and Uganda. Those are also test sites. How are we going to push this technology on people? Let's figure out how they push back. And Ecuador is a pretty democratic country, and it's a test run, in my opinion. So I agree.
I mean, excellent points. I'm also interested in how these continued shocks to our systems, whether it's something like 9/11 or the COVID pandemic, how these sort of usher in this conversation where people are willing to basically exchange security for liberty, right? Or people perceive that these systems need to be implemented to keep us safe, and they're willing just to abandon higher principles of civil liberty and individual freedoms that we hold so dear. And why that's dangerous is because usually when we give up our freedom, we get neither freedom or security. In fact, in many instances, we're rendered less safe, I would argue. And, China, for example, the way they sort of exploited the pandemic to implement COVID safe health passes that, flashed a green light for somebody who was apparently negative of COVID and could then go grocery shopping. Some of these systems have even been tested in sort of a beta test manner in the US. I know there was one case in New York where they were testing technology that would scan people as they came into a sports stadium, to see if they were COVID negative or positive, utilizing this technology, but also facial recognition technology. And I think we have to ask, is this technological advancement necessary in order to keep us safe, and particularly when we're giving away all these freedoms in exchange, right?
Absolutely. And I got to say, guys, before this conversation balloons out of, control here and we go too deep, I actually think it'd be great to hear from the people, from the readers, from the viewers, I should say, what do you guys think? I mean, there's a lot of different pieces to this, discussion of surveillance. So much stuff has been tested over COVID. Let us know your thoughts. Is the surveillance state here to stay? Can we push back against it? Is it ballooning out of control? That's it. That's all.